Oh hi, I'm the Heretic. Now you may have stumbled upon this video or were linked to it by someone you know. However you found it, I thank you for being curious enough to click on this video to hear what I have to say, as I promise this will be a very important conversation, especially in the coming months. So, let's talk voting. In the not too distant future, you're going to hear a lot about an upcoming election. Maybe it's July 2019 and it's still a fair distance away. Or it's September 2020 with everyone thinking they'll help decide if the White House will host a Democrat or Republican for the next 4 years. On the news, panelists and pundits will argue about who you should vote for. Twitter and Facebook and other social media sites will be inundated with campaign talk, both in ads and among social circles, in addition to manipulating what information you see to conform to the biases of the social media giants. The election will increasingly dominate the topics of chats between you, your friends, family, and coworkers. Which leaves one asking, who should I vote for? How will I know if who I'm voting for serves my interests? How do I even know what my interests are? Is voting an effective means of achieving societal change? Now, the ideal of voting is that each of us, as individuals, has our interests represented in government. We do this by voting in propositions or representatives who, represent our interests, and should they fail to do so, we just vote them out. However, voting is not a market transaction in which both parties come out better. It's a win-lose proposition, and not everyone can actually have their voices heard. The 55% that voted for the winning proposition or candidate decided for 100% of that society in which the proposition or candidate will be in power. The 45% who voted for B instead of A demonstrated their belief that A was contrary to their interests. Thus, the 45% lose. This win-lose dichotomy demonstrates that elections cannot be in the interests of everyone. Someone is necessarily worse off as a result, and is not going to have their interests met. While the actual margin of victory will change election by election, if we assume that everyone in the winning majority has their interests met by their choice, there is a large probability they will not be met. More often than not, even the winners do not have their interests met. After all, the process by which a candidate or proposition in direct democracies is even put up for a vote is rarely itself up for a vote. Well, yes, in US elections, candidates are selected for via a primary system, where who gets to be a party candidate is up for a vote. Who the primary candidates are themselves is not up for a vote. As of July 15, 2019, there are 271 candidates registered with the Federal Election Commission seeking the party nomination to run for President of the United States from the Democrat Party. Which of those 271 will represent your interests? Did you vote for them? How many of them will actually be on the Democrat primary ballot? Certainly not 271. Even if you could vote for all of them, we still have the problem of candidacy being an arbitrary selection process. The only way to prevent this is to have a primary election for the primary election, and then a primary election for that primary election for the primary election. An endless recursion of elections to decide who gets to run in an election, to decide who gets to run in an election, to decide who gets to run in an election, ad infinitum. Returning to our primary candidates, if 55% of voters are having their interests met in a general election, then the actual number must be much smaller, as only a fraction of them voted in the primary for that candidate. The current nominee may not have been the primary candidate who best represented their interest. If we are to assume that people vote for what is in their interests, then it cannot be said that more than 1/10 of voters are having their interests met. And this number shrinks significantly even more when we recall that primary candidacy is not itself voted for, and there are many voters who may be disinterested in all primary candidates. Recall then that this 1/10 number only counts voters. It doesn't count felons, immigrants, citizens under 18, or other people who are ineligible to vote. And even then, it only counts people who actually register to vote. Of those that register, only a fraction of them vote. In 2016, under 56% of eligible voters actually voted, and of them, they represent roughly 2/5 of America's population. The 55% of my hypothetical example represents only 40% of Americans, and of those, only, say, 20% voted for that candidate in the primary. If it is argued that voting is the way for we the people to make our voices heard in a democracy and have our interests represented through our votes, then using the numbers I just described, it cannot be said that more than 4.4% of people actually are having their interests met. This number represented is going to be far, far lower if voters were permitted to participate in the infinite number of recursion elections that is required for democratic participation to stay true to its principles of popular selection. Now let's also remember that these votes do not occur in real time. We are only permitted to vote when the state says we can, and we are restricted from removing them until the state deigns to grant us this permission. Even if you are part of the lucky 4.4% who had their candidate win, their actions in office are often going to be contrary to their promises, and therefore contrary to your interests. But you're stuck with him until the end of his electoral term. And there's not a damn thing you can do about it. But this all assumes that when people vote, they do so in favor of their interests, and aren't just voting defensively, not just settling for the lesser of two evils, preferring a candidate less injurious to their interests rather than one that is favorable to them. This was a common theme in the 2016 presidential election, when both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were promoted and supported on the basis of being less horrible than their opponents. The protection of one's natural rights is in voters' interest. However, someone voting defensively cannot be said to believe that the candidate they are voting for acts in favor of their interests either, any more than a man who prefers being punched over being stabbed is in favor of violence being inflicted upon him. Let it never be said that voting is consent to have the government strip away our natural rights. Furthermore, we should discuss the issues. We, the people, are never consulted on the problems that exist in our day-to-day life, and because individuals are different, have different lives, and experience the world differently, we are all going to always have different problems. Occasionally, we're pulled on our concerns, but when the government addresses our problems, they always propose solutions that are at our own expense. There's no denying this. The government produces nothing. It earns nothing, save that which is done with money it stole from someone else first through taxation. On occasion, a candidate will promise some reprieve from legislative plunder and oppression through tax credits or abolishing legislation, but these are only slight alleviations of tyrannization. It's a form of bribery, in which candidates sell back a scrap of the liberty they stole from you. Meanwhile, if you attempt to bribe a government agent, they call it a felony. Even so, the act of voting is inconsequential. Presidential, Senate, House, gubernatorial, and even state legislature races in America have margins of victory in the hundreds of thousands. Even in tight races, the probability of your vote altering the outcome of an election is infinitesimal. A voter has their time better spent at a movie theater, working at a job, or playing the lottery. The act of voting has a lesser chance of affecting the outcome of an election as the flaps of a butterfly's wings do of repelling a hurricane. Of course, this assumes that the outcome of an election even matters. Certainly, the actions of candidate or Proposition A will vary from B's, but the fundamentals don't change. In the United States, government spending grows under Republicans. Wars continue under Democrats. The best that is ever offered is some marginal solution to the grave injustices committed by the government to persons both foreign and domestic. One overshadowed by the promises to spend other people's money on tyrannization. Candidates promise to solve problems, but those problems are always solved at your expense. Infrastructure spending, paid for with stolen money, trade wars, tariffs, all of which make goods and services more expensive, universal health care, all proposals done to impoverish you. We need universal health care because private insurance companies have too much say in what services they can sell. We need government to spend more money on infrastructure because they know what to do with your money better than you. Tax the rich more because they keep too much of the money they earned. Every policy change is promoted as a lofty benefit to society, but its costs and the extent of the injustices created are always downplayed. The government has no market incentive to produce more efficiently, nor any way of determining what people actually want. Every product, good, or service the government will ever provide will necessarily be inferior to their privately produced counterpart. This may seem like an abstract argument, but these have very real consequences on society. We see the effects of programs like infrastructure spending or welfare. After all, you can see things like the Hoover Dam, but what you can't see are the technological innovations, cures to diseases, or great advancements in scientific knowledge that were prevented from existing because of resources being stolen from those projects, or even those projects being outright banned. We're led to believe that ritualistic participation in organizations with a vested interests in the growth and power of the state will somehow lead to positive outcomes. Failure to cause political change through civil participation must necessitate further civil participation, until participation becomes an end goal unto itself. The metric of success not being the extent to which you can rescind the state's encroachment upon your rights, but how many people you can convince to your point of view, how many players on your team, reducing the act of voting from an attempt to use politics in your interests to an affirmation of tribal allegiance. And these allegiances trick us into directing our enmity towards the rival party. The win-lose dichotomy necessarily manipulates voters into believing that if they don't use the power and violence of the state to meet their material interests, then their rivals will. Oppression is then framed as a result of the rival party, rather than a logical consequence of this coercive monopoly upon society. If you don't like being taxed by Democrats, then just vote Republican. If you don't like wars, then just vote Democrat. For the system to work, voters are required to overlook the extent to which the party system and the left-right dichotomy limits our understanding of problems and limits the solutions to two predefined options, all of which will increase the authority the state has over our lives. Voters must also overlook the extent to which the two parties share a common interest. As political parties rely on political institutions for their membership, funding, and relevance, their interests are in the state and its acquisition of power. If there was no state, then who would care about joining the Republican or Democrat Party? Now recall that I said that government relationships are win-lose. Even if your preferred candidate does win, you still lose. Throughout our lives, we are told that we are in charge of the government, that they answer to us, and it is by voting that we make our voices, our affirmation, and our objections heard. Yet what group that takes a percentage of another group's property can arbitrarily determine what percentage they can take, creates rules that the other group must abide by, tells the other group where to live, what resources they are allowed to have, how to use those resources, where to use those resources, who they can, cannot, and must associate with, and enforces all of these arbitrary rules with kidnapping, death, or the threat thereof, what group would do all of that, yet have the audacity to claim they are subordinate to the group they are victimizing? Would such a claim be truth, or merely confirming the completely uncontroversial opinion that our government is full of liars? Is the win-lose dichotomy between Party A and Party B, or between you and the state. Would any rational voter, knowing all this, call voting a win? If they truly represent us, then we must be the most self-destructive, masochistic sons of bitches this universe has ever seen. Our participation through voting perpetuates this system. Every second of activity we spend voting and encouraging others to vote is time that could be spent building networks, gaining resources, and trading in ways that prevents the elderly sociopaths we all know to be liars from getting our money. Even more insidiously, the more effort we put into political participation as a means of political change, the less inclined we are to seek alternatives because of an innate desire to see our time investments pay off. A form of gambler's fallacy. Every action of the state that advances its interests weakens our capacity to defend ourselves against it. And if you still aren't convinced that voting doesn't work, well, consider what would happen if nobody voted. Then the President of the United States is picked by the House of Representatives, and the Vice President is picked by the Senate. The government gets to pick who gets to be in government. Now tell me again that you have a choice? But there is hope. A way to affect political change and to meet your interests without needing to beg the state for your liberty back. Using cryptocurrency, it has never been easier for people to exchange goods and services, all without the government getting their hands on your property. Crypto operates on a peer-to-peer blockchain, meaning the only people who know about any given transaction are either party. As such, taxation and economic restrictions are completely unenforceable. After all, how can they tax a transaction that they don't even know exists? China has all but banned cryptocurrency, yet the country yields the largest Bitcoin exchange traffic in the world, used by dissidents, corrupt government agents, and ordinary people alike. In Russia, cryptocurrency is outright banned, yet there are villages who only accept crypto, not Russian rubles. With it, whether or not the state is able to restrict our economic activities and take our money is decided entirely by us. We can do this without needing to ask permission from others around us or engaging in some kind of religious ritual. When we trade outside the fences the government has built for us, we deprive them of the resources they need to plunder us in the first place. More importantly, because it's outside their system of restrictions and taxes, it's more profitable for us to do so, both for producers and consumers. As networks of exchange grow, the amount of resources denied to the state increases, and no government can survive being starved of resources. Political change can be done by buying a gallon of milk, all to the material benefit of everyone in win-win market transactions rather than the win-lose relationships of the state. Of course, the state won't simply take this lying down, but by raising taxes, printing money, therefore devaluing government currencies, and increasing economic restrictions and oppression, they drive more people into the counter-economy. Their efforts counteracting us only fuel their inevitable demise. They're screwed, and there's not a damn thing they can do about it. Friends, let us not be deluded into thinking that voting gives us control over the state, for if it did, they surely not permit us to do so. Those pushing you to vote are operating under a set of interests in opposition to your own. That is, unless you're a lying sociopath who lives at the expense of others. Voting is worse than useless, for it tricks us into wasting our time and distracts us from building the counter-economic networks that bring about real change. We can be free, and we don't need to wait for the first Tuesday in November to do so. What do you say?